Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much indeed for coming today. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Lewis. I'm the Dean of the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. And really it's my role to welcome you all, colleagues from within Loughborough University and also our external friends and colleagues who've come to spend the afternoon with us to celebrate Loughborough University's excellence in physiology. Many of you I know were just at the plaque unveiling, so that was fantastic and great to join you for that. We've got a really interesting programme today. We're going to hear from the Physiological Society and we're going to hear from a number of colleagues who work in the area just to understand what a role that we Loughborough University have had in physiology over the years. The session chair for the afternoon is Steve, and Steve is going to do the housekeeping stuff. Don't know if you want to do it now.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Thanks very much, Mark. And yeah, I'd like to say I'll be co-chairing with Abby McClellan, who's a PhD student in physiology, focusing on cardiovascular and exercise physiology. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephen Bailey. I'm the Physiological Society representative for the school. And just to reinforce Mark's message, it's a fantastic honour for us as a school to receive this award. So, a huge thank you to the Physiological Society, and thanks to all the many colleagues in the room who've made such a large contributions to physiology to allow us to achieve such a prestigious award. Also, a very big thank you to Esther, who's been absolutely brilliant today in terms of coordinating things. She's even left me notes because she knows I'd forget things. So,
thank her.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to read verbatim. So again, we're not expecting a fire drill today. So if we do have a fire alarm, please make your way through the foyer and we will convene outside. The toilets, for those of you who are any external here, they are just located through the exhibition area. So once you work your way through the exhibition area, you'll be able to find signs for the toilet. And then after the presentations today, we'll work outside then for the networking reception. So yeah, very welcome to all of you today, and we will start now with the presentations.
Brilliant. And I'm going to thank you very much, Steve, and we'll crack on because I know some people have got some things they want to do at 5 o'clock. I think there's a football match on. So I'm going to hand over to Dariel Burdass, who's the Chief Executive of the Physiological Society.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting Mike and I here today. In my role, this is one of the most exciting things that I do, coming out into institutions and meeting members. And what makes today really special is this is the second of the plaques that we have put up. And as Mike said in his introduction, to be awarded one of these Excellence in Physiology plaques means that you have shown to be really distinguished as a department in the delivery of sport, exercise and health physiology. And all your impacts have to be reviewed by our nominations committee before it goes forward and the award is made. So I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate this honour of the Blue Plaque for Excellence in Physiology. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the community of physiologists which we all make up, and about how we're trying to build our community, how we're trying to be more diverse and more inclusive, and that's in all of its facets, in terms of geography, in terms of discipline, in terms of career stage. If you are a physiologist, the door is open. We want you to be part of our community because together we are stronger. Now, how do I move this? Does this pointer move me forward? Or,
yes.
Yeah. So I think what's really important when we look at physiology, it goes across from the basic research to the translational and the clinical, and people are moving between those areas. And we also have physiologists moving out into industry as well. And all of this work has to be underpinned by excellent education training all the way through research. And I think what was interesting, we recently did a member survey and we found that 50% of our members were engaged in research and teaching, and another 25% in teaching. So we have a large number of our members who are involved in the teaching of the discipline as well. And somebody said to me, my background was so many years ago, but I suppose if you were saying where do I come from in terms of science, I was a microbiologist, and somebody spoke to me, what makes physiologists different? And I was like, well, it's a science. And they went, no, it is more than a science. And I have, since joining the Physiological Society, come to believe this. What makes physiologists particularly special is they are able to work from the very small to the very big and back again. So they're asking these big questions. And the other thing is they work across systems as well. So I do have another slide that I haven't put up, but I think when you look at that, how you see going from the atom right up to epidemiological studies and then across organs, across systems, it is really impressive. So what I think makes physiologists an exciting group to be among is the way you ask these big questions and work together as a community to solve them. So we are looking at the society, how we can shape the future of physiology by connecting our community. And we launched in 2023 our new strategy, which underpins how we are going to do that. But I'd like to talk to you about what I call the 3 Ps of how you can get involved in your community. And I actually saw this at the American Physiological Society, but they don't use it anymore. And I thought it was great. It's the 3 Ps of being involved with your society, involved in physiology. And you can publish with us, you can present with us, and you can participate with us. And so what does that mean? So we run meetings, and we are changing our approach to meetings. We have one main meeting, and this year you'll see we're going to Northumbria, and we're doing that in collaboration with the Scandinavian Physiological Society. So we're really collaborating. In 2025, we are doing it through IUPS and Europhysiology, again, to try and build a community of physiologists. So 2025 will be a global event in Frankfurt, which I think is going to be exciting. So I please implore you to present your work at our conferences, and that gives you the ability to network on this global platform. But we listened to members. Members said what they really wanted as well were these 2-day focus meetings. I suppose they're a little bit like a Gordon conference or a Keystone conference. And they are what I term, they are by the community, for the community. And what I've done is I've pulled out some of those that are more relevant to sport, exercise, health. And you can see since end of 2023 through to mid-2025, we've got 5 conferences that should be of interest to some of you. And if we are not representing what you do up there, and you've got a great idea, approach our events team, because what we can do is we can help you to put on a conference, and you could showcase your university. We are going back into institutions where possible to showcase those institutions and the work that they do. But I think, as Clyde said in his introduction when we unveiled the plaque, that's how he remembers those terrible oral communications where quick fire questions were put towards you. And I think that's what we're going back to, all the best bits of that. So we're making it small, we're making it focused, and we're making it an opportunity for you to network with those people directly involved in your area. And the other thing is publishing. Publishing is a key part of any academic's career, any researcher's career. And we have 3 journals, the Journal of Physiology, Experimental Physiology, and Physiological Reports. And they all take papers in sport, exercise, and health physiology. And just to highlight in one, this is from Experimental Physiology. Since 2020, 29%, so just shy of 30% of the papers are classed as environmental and exercise physiology. And there will be other physiology within the other sections. So, there will be other exercise physiology within the other sections as well. But you can see that 30% is actually classified under the environmental and exercise section. And then I've just put in, these are the top 5 most cited exercise and sports papers in EP and the number of citations that they've received as well, to show that we are, this is definitely part of the community that we are working with. And then finally, we've got our calls for special issues in the JP and experimental physiology. So we have in EP, it's physiology in the Olympics, and exercise is medicine, and in JP, it's the regulation of cardiovascular and skeletal muscle function in exercise. So again, if you have anything relevant, please think about submitting to one of those special issues. Again, if you think that we could be doing better with our special issues and we're missing something, please contact the editors-in-chief. We have Damien Bailey, who is editor-in-chief of experimental physiology, and Kim Barrett, who is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Physiology. So we really want to hear from you, our members, on what we could be doing, how we could be improving what we do. And then finally, there's the participation. We can't do what we do without our experts, and you are our experts. So it's absolutely key that you help us to raise the visibility of physiology. And there's loads of ways that you can get involved. Serving on a committee. We've just had a call out for trustees. If you are a member, could you all vote for the person that you would like to sit on our Board of Trustees? There is an early career representative on the board. That's a protected position, and a general trustee we're looking for this year. We've got trustee positions coming up next year. If you're unsure about whether you want to be a trustee, you can serve on a committee, you can help organise sessions, you can become a society rep. That's a great way of getting involved. You can contribute to our policy reports, which Mike is going to talk about, and you can share your research and career stories through either our blog, podcast, or Physiology News, the member magazine. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved with the society. So if you just remember the 3 Ps, publish, and participate and present, and if you can do just a little bit of that, together we will have a stronger community and be able to raise the profile of physiology. Because I think as we go forward to have a healthier society that is going to be able to add those 10 years of health that the government wants us to be, it wants us to live, 5 years, they want to add 5 years of healthy ageing. And to be able to add 5 years of healthy ageing with the amount of comorbidities that we are suffering from in this population, it's going to require physiologists to be able to input into that, to be able to us to change the story. What we want to be able to see is not be surprised that a 70-year-old can do something or an 80-year-old that can do something. I was in Japan some time ago, and I was out walking, and it was concrete. It was a concrete high-rise estate, and yet everybody was out doing some form of exercise. And they didn't have any equipment. They were using the benches. They were using whatever was there, but they were doing that. And that improves people's health and mental well-being. And that's the way we are going to be able to tackle some of these crises like we have, such as obesity and type 2 diabetes. So I think it's going to be a fascinating subject discipline to be involved in. And I'm really excited to hear your talks and how you're all contributing to some of the global challenges that we face today. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be around if anybody wants to ask any questions about how you become involved with the society.
Thank you very much indeed. And next up is Mike Tipton, the President of the Physiological Society.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, everybody, for coming today to listen to what we have to say. And we obviously are here to celebrate excellence that's represented in this room. And I thought it might be worth talking a little bit. One of the reasons I'm here is because I've watched Loughborough from afar, and with some envy, for some years. And so I think we should just talk a little bit about that link and what the people in this room have achieved. And then we'll go on to talk a little bit about some of the similarities between what you do and what the Physiological Society does. Now, if you are of a weak disposition, don't look at this slide. But this is state-of-the-art equipment circa 1981. And I suspect some people in this room don't even know what some of that stuff does. So let me just point it out. I've only got a point of one. I'll just point it out. So in those days, if you had a cricket bat, you had to rub linseed oil into it. Otherwise, it wouldn't get through a season. Can you believe that? If you had a tennis racket, state-of-the-art, Dunlop Max Ply, McEnroe won Wimbledon with it, you had to have a little press to keep it in, because if it got damp, it would walk. The cricket balls and the rugby balls were not, you couldn't hold them. It was like a bar of soap when it got wet. There was no sort of dimplex on the rugby ball. That try which the Barbarians scored against the All Blacks was played with a bar of soap. Really, amazing. So the distance that we've come. In those days, these were the state-of-the-art socks that I used to get every Christmas. I still do. Stan Smith, the near pornographic shorts. The state-of-the-art Fred Perry. No smart materials, no enhanced evaporation, no vapor permeability and transfer. The same with your squash racket, you have to put a press for that as well. And people in this room and people like you have completely transformed the sport. Not only in terms of the technology, but also what occurs in things like muscles, how they're fed, what their nutritional requirements are, how they function. So sport has changed out of all recognition in just a relatively short period of time. And as a consequence of which we see better performance, we see better spectacle. And obviously that's being challenged now, particularly by external factors such as climate change. But let's not underestimate how far we've come. I'm wearing this tie for the first time since 1981. This is Madeley College. And I used to come to Loughborough and get beaten at rugby on a fairly regular occasion. We beat them once, I think, in a semi-final of the Colleges Cup back in about 1979. But just the other thing that's worth noting, look at the state of the pitch. Even that's just been transformed out of all recognition. So we're not, and it's because of people in this room and people like you. How ironic that in October I stood on Hellfire Corner in Red Roof Rugby Club watching Loughborough students play Red Roof. Red Roof won at home and Loughborough students won here. So if anyone wants to come to Cornwall and watch Loughborough students play next year, get in contact. That's why we're here, because you're number one. And I'm very happy to recognise that. And I'm sure you'll hear more about it, so I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder. It wasn't a difficult decision to give an Excellence in Physiology Award to Loughborough University. And some of those advances, I say here, in muscle function, in nutrition, came from people in this room. And I'm looking very much forward to hearing that. You collaborate. So you collaborate in these areas with sports group in Loughborough. I see George, Professor Happiness, sitting there. I know you collaborate with him. Collaboration is absolutely essential. And it's going to become more essential as we grapple with the big issues of AI, of climate change, of the way medicine's changing. And so I applaud you for the collaboration that you've been involved in. Of course, this is our kind of area down in Portsmouth in the extreme environments laboratory, so we keep an eye on that. I'm a bit off of that at the moment, having just come back from the Austrian Ironman, so this is why I'm sort of walking a little bit like this. But I just make the point, the oldest person who completed that Ironman in something like 14 or 15 hours was in the 80 to 84 category, which has blown my chances of ever getting to number one. We've mentioned climate change, and I'm really pleased to see that there are people in the room working. This is an existential threat, not just to humanity, but clearly to sport as well. There's 5 times greater chance that the Paris Olympics will suffer a heat wave in 2024 than when it was last there in 1924. And that heat wave, if it follows recent heat waves, could well put the temperatures close or into the 40s. That is a threat to life and limb, and one which I don't think the administrators have fully grasped or done everything they could do about. And that, to answer those questions, it's not just a sport, exercise and health physiologist you need. You need to be working with botanists, with designers, with a whole raft of other people, psychologists, to make sure that you get the correct approach. As you've heard from Dariel, I'm chairman of the policy committee of the Physiological Society, and there's some of the issues that we're dealing with and publishing on. So artificial intelligence I've mentioned, precision medicine I've mentioned, and climate change I've mentioned. One of the tricks we miss as sports, exercise and health scientists is when you write that bit in your grant where you say about output, you always say, oh, we will publish in a smart journal. Why not actually produce a policy document? And that's what the Physiological Society can do. One of the things that you can do with the Physiological Society is get in touch with the excellent policy team and say, we've got this information, we want to not just publish it in the scientific literature or in the grade literature, we also want to do a policy launch at Westminster, and we want to do a policy document. And so if we look at that climate change we'll pick because it's topical, there's some of the climate change documentation. Physiology and climate change, the climate emergency, bringing mechanistic understanding and real-world impact, red alert. So these are policy documents that have been produced in the last few years by the Physiological Society on climate change. This one up here I've put in as well, because it was the one that we produced because we were fed up with people talking about rip-off degrees and trying to pretend that sport and exercise science wasn't a value to the community. It's an enormous value to the community, not only in terms of the well-being it brings, watching England win football matches, not long now, but also in what it does in terms of public health and engagement in physical activity. So if this is your thing, go and have a look at that and think about producing a policy document at the end of your grant application. We have a plan. This is not just a one-off. These things will go on, and you'll be seeing this. We're working very closely with the Wellcome Trust at the moment for a grant call later in the year on climate change and mental health. And you can also go and have a look at the Exercise Physiology Hub as well if you want to, and get involved in that in the way that you've just heard from Dariel. So that's all I wanted to say, really. I'm the sort of the light relief before you get the really good stuff, the warm-up act. But the one thing I really want you to do, because sport and exercise and health scientists are really good at it, is celebrate. Don't get all modest and embarrassed about your success. Getting an award from the Physiological Society is no mean achievement. Trust me, as Clyde said, this was the highest bar that you could try and get over when you were presenting. It was like presenting to a pack of lions, and one ear would go up, and then another one, and then they'd be all over you. I've seen people leave the stage in tears. I was one. Sport, exercise and health scientists are very good at celebrating. This is not the Scottish football supporters. There are people on this slide who I will not name for legal reasons. You should know at least one of them very well. So go, and they all achieve, pretty much all of them achieve greatness in the sport, exercise and health field. So this evening, if you get the chance, celebrate your achievement today. It's well earned, and I congratulate you. Thank you very much.
Would our chair like to come forward? I'll give you back the programme as well.
No problem.
I'll just tell you where we are.
Dariel, are they yours? I'll just before he goes off.
Yes, thanks very much for those excellent talks there by the Physiological Society to set the scene, and As someone who's been a proud member of the Physiological Society since 2011, I would really encourage you to look at the website. There's a lot of great resources there. I got my first PI grant from Physiological Society, so I've certainly benefited a lot through interacting with the Society. So I would encourage colleagues to look at the website and all the excellent resources that are there. So we're going to now move into the talks that are hopefully going to showcase why we've been awarded this accolade from the Physiological Society. So we're going to start off with a bit of a historical overview of the physiology development at Loughborough University, and then we're going to move on to some talks by some colleagues in the school to highlight the current state of play with some of the key areas that we're focusing on in physiology. I would like to apologise that we can only have 3 speakers. We could have made an entire day of this showcasing, but the 3 speakers who will speak towards the end have made a really good job of highlighting the contribution of various colleagues across these areas. So I'd like to thank them all for agreeing to do this. So the first presentation today in this afternoon session will be a joint presentation by Professor Clyde Williams and Professor Mark Lewis, and they're going to talk us through the evolution of physiology at Loughborough. It'll start off with Professor Clyde Williams giving us an overview of the history and track right through to the latest developments in more recent times by Professor Mark Lewis, who's the current Dean of the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. So I'm sure we can all agree that there's no one better placed to talk us through the development of physiology at Loughborough than Professor Clyde Williams. So if you could all join me in welcoming Clyde.
Well, thank you again to the Physiological Society for this great honour in presenting us with recognition of the work which has gone on over almost 35 years here at Loughborough. And I enjoyed seeing Mike's slides, but what he didn't tell you is his leadership in all things aquatic, especially in terms of prevention of drowning, and the physiology there is absolutely wonderful. A wonderful experience of how you go from whole body to cell. So my brief talk is about where did we start, and sorry, I just made this slide. So as you can see from the slide, in 1977 the College of Education, which is on the campus here, merged with the university, and at that time there wasn't even a road between the college and the university. A road was opened up once amalgamation was established. The first professor of in the department was Professor Harry Thomason, and became Professor of Physical Education and Sports Council, Sports Science. He managed to attract a large grant from the Sports Council on the understanding that it was to be used to set up the first full-time research group in sports science. And the brief was rather broad, and I'll show you in this slide. It was really to look at athletic performance, and you can see if I can get my pointer going. There you are. And so the brief is fairly broad, but we had to act as a central hub for all things athletic, both elite and sub-elite. So in designing the whole menu of work, or program of work, we start off with athletic performance and dividing into endurance sports and sprint sports, and within that marathon running and wheelchair racing, and in the sprint sports swimming and team games. And we also, towards the latter stages of our funding, began to introduce population health with walking and its impact on lipid profiles, and then also asthma and exercise. Now, it would be easy to go through in a smorgasbord way and pick little bits and give you a story, but what I'd like to do was to tell you about one theme which we developed, and the theme was about looking at the physiology of elite athletes, and here's a famous athlete, and by comparison, exploring the physiology of elite athletes was relatively easy because we built up the tools which we amassed from the literature and personal experience. And I should say, in dealing with elite athletes, there are two things, major things we learned. The first is that in dealing with an elite athlete, you have to be very careful. If you take a thumb prick sample of blood 2 weeks before competition and he underperforms, you're to blame. The second thing is that coaches will only give you a certain amount of their time to work on athletes, and they get very impatient. So even though you come in and work on Saturdays and Sundays with the athletic groups, it's too much of the coaching time being taken out. So as a result of that, we developed the bleep test, and we gave the disc to the coaches, and they could run their own VO2 max test. And I should say, when I see this photograph, you might think that's rather special, and it is special. But the most important and nerve-wracking athlete we had to deal with was our Vice-Chancellor at the time, who decided he was going to run the London Marathon, and he had to run it in under 4 hours. And if he didn't, then my job was at risk. So what we came to Loughborough was the endurance work was relatively straightforward. What was missing was how do you deal with multiple sprint sports? Because the coaches from team sports would say, well, we're not endurance athletes. How do we train? And can you endorse our training methods? So I remember being in Aberdeen and being asked that question by a coach. And I remember a paper published by Rodolfo Magaria, who was a paper and pencil physiologist in Italy, a famous one. And he said that if you run for 10 seconds flat out and have just 30 seconds recovery, you can repeat it all day. So I made the mistake of mentioning this at a coaching conference. A year later, at the same conference, the coaches came back and said, absolutely rubbish. You can't possibly do that. And then I realized the mistake was, when they were talking about maximum exercise, they were talking about the exercise intensity, which would elicit VO2 max. So we started looking for all kinds of ways of measuring peak power output. And a friend of mine coming back from the Wingate Institute in Israel gave me a manuscript describing the Wingate test, which we modified and used to our advantage. So we explored this idea of looking at peak performance. We used a cyclogometer, and we could biopsy and so on and so forth. And we did 6-second sprints with 30 seconds rest between the two. Now what we were trying to do was get a model of something which would be acceptable to coaches and athletes and provide them with information on which they could base further training and activities. I say 6 seconds because one of our undergraduate projects was to look at how long any sprint in several sports would take. And in none of the sports, the team sports, was anyone running flat out for more than 5 seconds. So we did these interesting studies on the peak power output recovery, and you can see the decline in power output. So we were able to investigate why that was, and it was basically because of the phosphocreatine stores weren't recovering fast enough. We measured muscle pH, and that wasn't the problem. We changed buffering, and that didn't do anything. It was really how quickly you could replace your phosphocreatine, and we later went on to show that by doing, the more aerobically you're trained, the greater your aerobic capacity, the faster your phosphocreatine stores climb. So we're quite happy with this. Nice, neat little model. We could do a whole range of studies. We did the biochemistry of skeletal muscle, looking at the glycolytic pathways and where the blocks were. So quite happy. And the coaches came along and said, yeah, but it's not running, is it? So this is an example of how the end user can start influencing the research direction. So we said, no, it isn't running. So I came across a non-motorized treadmill being used in a health gym, and so I got one of the team, Hendrik Lacomi, to have a look at it and see if we could instrument it. Sorry, go this way, right? Sorry. Here it is. So what we did was get this non-motorized treadmill and fix it up so we could actually measure the power output, our strain gauges, and so on and so forth. And that allowed us to meet the criticism that we could study multiple sprints while running. So all went well, and we did some interesting studies. This is John Brewer on the treadmill sprinting, Mary Neville taking the measurements. And so in the biopsy study, we could look at the ATP turnover in just 6 seconds. And as you can see, the 50% of the energy comes from glycogen, about 48% from phosphatidylcholine, and a very small amount from ATP. So we went on and did a whole series of studies looking at recovery, looking at diet, and so on and so forth. And we were very content and almost smug, because it was the first non-motorized treadmill to be used in this way in the UK. Then the coaches came along saying, yeah, but it's not real running, is it? Just as we were settling into feeling we could generate a lot of data from this, we had to think again. So what we did, we modified the bleep test, which allowed us to, over 20 meters, do a series of, we designed the program so it would do a mixture of walking, sprinting and running over 90 minutes. So it wasn't exactly the same exercise pattern you would see in a football game or a rugby game, but it was an approximation. And the people we had to perform this, and the athletes, team games players and so on, so were very comfortable with this. And we were able to do a whole series of experiments, everything from looking at running performance, changing their diet overnight, running in the heat at different temperatures by heating up this huge sports hall, and PhD students, being dedicated people as they are, would sleep in the sports hall in order to make sure the temperature hadn't fallen too much, then switch on the industrial heaters to keep the temperature up at 30 degrees. Huge amount of personal sacrifice. And we were able to biopsy them and look at the change in glycogen. We were able to put nasogastric tubes in so that we could have a look whether or not the sports drink they were taking at the intervals actually got through to the muscles. And we even set it up so we could look at soccer skills and performance there. So in a sense, this little story is about how the end user can influence your research. And we went from very cozy cyclogometry through to what we thought was a great running model, through to this free running model, which allowed us to look at a whole range of different factors influencing performance. And so many times it's worth listening to the end user, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to use the information. And all this wouldn't have been possible without the research students, all of which I say will have presented at least once at the Physiological Society. Thank you very much indeed.
Before you sit down, Clyde, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just sharing with everyone the anecdote you shared with me about supporting the swimmers at the time you guys were doing that stuff.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said on that little overview slide, there's lots of stories I tell you, and many of them are human stories about overcoming various obstacles. And one of them, it really sounds like a history man. So in 1980, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, banned Olympic teams going away to overseas training camps. And so British swimming were based in Crystal Palace. And so we were asked by the national coach that we'd worked with the swimmers at short course and long course championships throughout the year to go down to Crystal Palace, and we developed a rapid method of getting blood samples from the Euro, which is now fairly standard. And so we take these, we use the length of the pool as our odometer, and we first the swimmers that do their set routines. We take the bloods, dispense the bloods, put them into tubes, jump on the train, back to Loughborough, do the analysis, spending almost all night doing the analysis, back on the train down to Crystal Palace to have a debriefing with the coach. And one interesting thing was these couple of American swimmers were on American scholarship trials, their performances and their lactates were absolutely terrible. And by questioning them, we found out that their coach in the US had recommended that if they wanted to get big, strong and fast, they should have high protein diets. And the protein diet they were allocated was 12 eggs a day, raw eggs. And so that was one of the reasons why they didn't get very far. So we have experience, and some of the human stories are almost better than some of the science.
Thank you, Clyde. My first experience at Physiological Society was when I graduated in 1990 from Reading with a degree in physiology and biochemistry, and it's been really brilliant being here over the last decade or so to really reflect on where this started with Clyde's great story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we've ended up and where we are today. And I think what was really interesting, we sit and talk to Clyde, and he's been fantastic since I've been dean, and always been a source of information and anecdote and telling me it's a stupid idea. Most of that, really. But to understand that at the time where Clyde talks about the support of athletes, it only just really started, and it was the largesse of the individuals and the university which enabled them to support them. Some of you are old enough to remember perhaps the Olympic Games in 1996, where Great Britain had the worst Olympic Games since about 1924. All sorts of angst and what have you. And that led to the formation of the National Lottery and the support of athletes via this programme. And really, when talking to Clyde, which really struck me is, of course, at that time it was Clyde and his colleagues and people like you who were supporting those athletes. And that kind of shifted. Well, it shifted at the English Institute of Sport, UK Sport Institute, who we still continue to do huge amounts of work with, and Vicky's actually very pivotal to that relationship with Loughborough University and UKSI currently, is that many of the people who then came here to learn about the stuff Clyde and other people were doing ended up being the support network. They ended up working English Institute of Sport. You'll know that other sports, back then, the only sport you could really make a living out of, or there was money in, was soccer, football, and maybe a bit of cricket. And that's changed so much in that time, support here through these kind of schemes, but also the professionalisation of other sports. And so people like Clyde supporting the athletes became people Clyde and others had trained. And I think as we continue the story, we've seen that develop over time. Clyde talks there all about a number of areas. This is a fantastic initiative, which 2005 now, wow. Feels like, to a lot of people, it feels like it's sort of new and still only arrived yesterday. But the Peter Harrison Centre, a 20-plus year philanthropic donation, has led to the institution being internationally renowned for disability sport research and the physiology contained within that. I'm not going to talk about any science in my talk, because you've got my colleagues following up behind who are going to tell you about the stuff which goes in this area. So you're going to hear from Vicky after. What was really interesting as well through the journey, if you like, that Clyde's talked about, is that if you looked at the study of illness and bad health, that had always been through the eye of the lens of pathology, i.e. looking at stuff which didn't work, looking at illness, looking at what had gone wrong. But actually, people started to realise, well, hang on a minute, through the work of people like Clyde and all the colleagues at Loughborough, why don't we study people where things go well, in inverted commas? Why don't we use that as a lens to look at health and well-being, as opposed to disease as a lens for health and well-being? And I think that was really one of the sort of pivotal changes in the last, or pivotal developments in the last 10 or 15 years, is because of the stuff Clyde and others had started. The research at Loughborough was furthering our knowledge of athlete health and performance. We're also beginning to knowledge an epidemic of poor health. And so why not use rather than pathology and illness, why not use wellness and health and peak performance as a way to try and understand the ways we might as well to intervene? And so could our knowledge of athlete health be applied to the non-athlete population to encourage an uplift in health and well-being of the nation? And alongside mass participation events, many colleagues who work with Park Run, but it was only really in the sort of the early 80s that people were starting taking up the jogging craze. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember that taking off in the 80s and people getting involved in recreational running. So it really was a start of the translation of some of those ideas and knowledge that Clyde talked about into the general population. And I guess the real sort of epitome of this, the kind of linking it again into sort of Olympic cycles, was the 2012 London Olympic Games, a massive catalyst for change, some would argue not, but we're here to debate that now. But for us, there was a massive thing we were involved in, the National Centre of Sport and Exercise Medicine, and the move into health. I remember when I started here, Clyde had been a champion of this from before those times, saying, yes, we need to use the knowledge that we have to help understand health and how we can keep people healthy. And this was a project, or was still a project, £30 million of capital investment to improve the nation's health through sport, exercise and physical activity. Still a major project that we're involved in. The money was to build buildings. As my colleague Rachel Thompson says, batteries not included. So we had to find a way to get the stuff within it working, but this is the building, the National Centre for Sport and Exercise Medicine building on our campus. This is a collaboration with the Universities of Nottingham, Leicester, Nottingham University Hospitals NHS Trust, University Hospitals Leicester NHS Trust, but also a network with colleagues in London and Sheffield as well, where the whole driver was to apply the world-class expertise and policies and practice and the sort of things that Clyde was talking about to benefit the health and well-being of the nation. And Esther, I can't remember the numbers, but can you remember how many people have now been helped she's gone out of the room. She's not been able to answer the question. But 10 years it's been up and running, and we're putting together a report of the 10 years, and it's tens of thousands of the general public who've been helped and been seen through the National Centre for Sport and Exercise Medicine Network. So I think that's a really pretty impressive legacy of the stuff that Clyde and his colleagues started being translated into the general population. And I think one of the things just to finish on now is that because of our work in the NCSEM and our reputation in this area, in physiology and many other areas, is the National Rehabilitation Centre. This is a £500 million programme, including a Defence Medical Rehabilitation Centre and a National Rehabilitation Centre just a few miles from here on the Stamford Rehabilitation Estate, to transform outcomes for people who have suffered potentially life-changing injury, trauma, illness, by integrating research, innovation, education and training with clinical practice. And that could be anything from a road traffic accident to someone who had a major mental health episode. We were asked to lead that as an academic institution because of the stuff Clyde and his colleagues started. That's why we were asked to lead the NCCM, and through that we've been asked to lead the NRC. And I think of all the stuff that we hear about, and we're going to hear about from colleagues today, that's a really amazing legacy that Clyde and others have started, to be able to be asked nationally and therefore internationally to lead these ventures. We tried to get a photo of everyone together, but that's our recent Christmas jumper party, just before Christmas, what a stupid thing to say. Christmas just gone. Esther, I asked a question that you weren't in the room. NCSEM, how many patient visits have there been across the NCSEM network since the foundation of the NCSEM 10 years ago?
Across the whole network?
Yeah.
We have about 70,000. Across the whole network, about 700,000.
700,000, sorry. That's interventions which wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the NCSEM, and that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for people like Clyde and his expertise in physiology and others. So I hope you've seen that Clyde and I have tried to tell you a little bit of a story about where we started, or where him and his colleagues started, and where we ended up now. I don't know when Sebco or the people who were standing in that sport hall, which I don't think exists anymore, heating up the room, would imagine that we were going to be at the forefront of multi-million-pound national and international drives to improve the health and well-being of the world. So, gives you a little bit of context, I hope, for the award, why we were awarded it. And I'm going to hand over to Steve now, so you're going to hear some people about some science now, and some of the things that they've been up to. Thank you very much indeed. Again, thank you very much for all coming along today, and I'll hand over to Steve. I keep saying the wrong thing as usual. Steve and Abby. Sorry, Abby. Steve and Abby. Abby. In fact, Abby's in charge, it looks like.
Oh, thanks, hair, that might be easier.
So thank you to Clyde and Mark for that really insightful discussion. It is a privilege to hear them both speak about the development and excellence in physiology at Loughborough. And I'm now just going to invite Professor Vicky Tolfrey up to talk about para-athletics and the development of physiology in that field. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much for being sort of a specialist topic today to sort of highlight the excellence in physiology here at Loughborough. I think I've read the script right, because what's fantastic is that I think I can see some really nice linkage already with the speakers before me. So I'm going to sort of start again more historical and then get to perhaps a little bit more the impact and the actual physiology, and I'll sort of pinch the picture that you've already seen. Just using now the motto in terms of where history begins. In all the sports halls, the sports centres here at Loughborough, we're very proud of our presence in the sporting space, and obviously now we're very proud of our award around excellence in physiology. But what I'd like to do here is highlight the groundbreaking research. It was in one of Clyde's slides around wheelchair racing. Now, excellence in exercise physiology in wheelchair racing started here at Loughborough. And here we have a paper that was published in the sort of late 90s, so following the Atlanta Games in 96, but a paper published by Ian Campbell, Clyde Williams and Henrik Lacomi. So we have the three individuals on just here. Clyde's perhaps quite modest, as he always is, but again, I must echo, world-leading research in the 90s in wheelchair racing. Wheelchair racing being, at the time, the sort of pinnacle of the Paralympics, the blue ribbon event of wheelchair racing at the Games. We had Tanny Gray-Thompson, a student here at Loughborough University, who took part in these studies, just like Sebastian Coe was taking place and sort of taking laboratory practices with Clyde. But what was the most important feature of this research, in my mind, again, was the mind of Henrik developing a system which enabled para-athletes, wheelchair athletes, to be tested at the same standards using ergometry equipment in the Loughborough labs. So to me, I took that away, and before this sort of plays the video, I'd just like to sort of show you again the historical influence that Loughborough played on me, a student at Manchester Metropolitan University, but then coming to Loughborough.
2, 1, go! Hit it as hard as you possibly can, Ivan. Come on, keep it going. Come on, that's good. Keep it working.
All I do for that final minute. Come on, keep the mouthpiece in. Keep it going.
Keep pushing, Ivan. Keep it going all the way through. Keep those arms going. That's brilliant.
Less than 5 to go. Come on, push it.
That's it, arm. Keep it going all the way through. Keep it going. Keep it going. Now stop.
Hands on the side.
Tremendous effort.
So that was me in the background, a young PhD student, but being mentored by someone that Clyde had mentored, a PhD student who graduated at Loughborough University, who then embarked on their first lecturing post at Manchester Metropolitan University. But the reason why I show that is the fact that we were putting bikes on top of tables. We were taking the sidebars off the treadmill, lifting athletes onto the treadmill. Not the most sort of dignified way of doing testing the para-athletes. But that led myself to come to Loughborough University, sort of 2 years into the Peter Harrison Centre being established at Loughborough University, which again I know Clyde was quite pinnacle in having those relationships with Peter Harrison and the Peter Harrison Foundation. But what that led to was the establishment of a world-leading research centre in Paralympic sport. The mission was to improve the sort of knowledge about Paralympic sport and to gain and promote the substantial health and quality of life benefits that can be gained through participation in disability sport and physical activity. So looking across the exercise continuum, rehabilitation, community to high performance sports. The centre was and is heavily involved in research, but we also provide that hub integrating with Loughborough Sport around providing sports science support to several GB squads, working with UK SI and the British Paralympic Association. The physiologists that have come through the centre are shown on this slide here. These are our graduates with PhDs that are now working with the British Paralympic Association, Great Britain Wheelchair Rugby, Great Britain Wheelchair Basketball. They're embedded in that. They're embedded in industry and providing sports science at the top and world leading. So what I'm trying to emphasise there is it's not only this sort of the science of collecting blood and muscles and things like that, is that we are the pipeline of talent in Paralympic high-performance sport. And I'm quite proud that that is a legacy of the 20 years to date of funding from the Peter Harrison Foundation. The way that we do that is that we embed the practitioner during the PhD journey into the sport. So here, on this slide here, we have Ben Stevenson, who is now head of physiology for the Paralympic triathletes, but he's here during an event with the head coach at the time offering physiological support during the events. Johnny Rowell, the former head coach, in this photo said the embedded practitioner approach created a foundation for two things: world-class support to athletes and collecting data to create useful and meaningful research. So, Ben's outside the lab, Ben's inside the lab. That embedded approach enables us to talk to the athletes, talk to the coaches, and get the right research questions addressed in the researching environment using exercise physiology. We moved to wheelchair rugby. We've adopted the same approach with wheelchair rugby. Not only now are we we're not putting the bikes on top of the tables, but we have an instrumented wheelchair ergometer, taking the philosophy of what Clyde was doing around non-motorised activities to look at sprint performance. But we've worked with Loader and collaborated internationally with Dutch colleagues to develop this instrumented wheelchair ergometer that enable us to look at wheelchair sprint performance. We have the scientist PhD students there at the Games in Tokyo. In Tokyo, we won the first team sport gold medal. But our athletes were coming to Loughborough, being physiologically assessed. We were looking at heat, humidity, cooling strategies. We collaborated with George Havenoff, just like Mike said, that we've got great resources through the ergonomic approach around the environment that our para-athletes compete in to optimise their warm-up, cool-down and performance. Not only have we done that, but we collaborate across disciplines. And so here is a quick video that shows you how we work with sleep experts in the world of Paralympic sport.
The study that we're currently conducting is really looking at sleep patterns of persons with a spinal cord injury, and it's quite common to note that some of the athletes that we work with do have problems with their sleep patterns.
So with this study, the participants have stayed in a hotel for a 24-hour period, so we could measure their core temperature and their skin temperature, and Margot have let us use their venue. In partnership with them, we've worked together to get the participants in. The main measure we have is polysomnography, which essentially is going to measure the brain waves of the athletes as they sleep. We'll also have some core temperature measurements. So at 7 a.m. in the morning, the participants will swallow a core temperature pill, and this will then allow us to measure their temperature throughout the day. What we'd like to see is if there's any association between the core temperature response at night and the polysomnography brain waves that we're recording.
Finding a solution for poor sleep would be great. If you know that you're doing everything you can physically to be the best you can be, even if it is just those tiny little margins, you're going to feel better, you're going to feel you've done everything.
All of our research here at Loughborough really is underpinned maybe by athletic performance, but it has a wider impact to the everyday health and well-being of persons with a spinal cord injury. So it's very important to use that model to understand the differences, to try and look at some interventions that ultimately might improve the quality of life.
So our work stretches, like I've illustrated, not only around the high performance, but also to the health and well-being and in rehabilitation as well. Interestingly, around special editions and physiology and things like that, just on Saturday I went to PubMed and I just put in some keywords. I put in physiology and Olympics, physiology and Paralympics. Now I know not all research articles are going to have those as keywords, and indeed there's different intricacies of sort of saying that you're doing research that has meaningful relations to Olympic, because it could just be that you're looking at running. But just for comparison here, I just want to sort of draw your attention to the small amount of research as of Saturday that still exists in terms of the sort of different focus around Olympic research versus the Paralympic research from an exercise physiology perspective. Obviously that's very interesting given the fact that a person with a spinal cord injury will have different GI, different digestion rates. If you're providing nutrition and fluid information or guidance through science of your non-disabled athletes, it's not going to be transferable to a person with a spinal cord injury. There's going to be differences in thermoregulation. A lot of the athletes that I work with will effectively, during competition, if they swallow one of those telemetry pills, might actually get a body core temperature of around about 40 degrees centigrade. So we've been working for several years looking at cooling techniques to try to optimise their performance and offset that rise in body core temperature. There are also issues around the heart rates and the blunted heart rate response during exercise, respiratory, all different aspects that, again, make working with Paralympic athletes very exciting to challenge the exercise physiology from what you might learn at an undergraduate level, a master's level, to transfer that knowledge to training advice for athletes who might have the sort of impaired function from a thermoregulatory perspective and all these other overarching factors because of the physiological consequences of a spinal cord injury. So we very much take this individualised approach. I know that happens in high performance sport anyway, but we might obviously look at the impairment of an athlete and say, let's cool that athlete before they go onto court to offset that rise in body core temperature, and let's bring the ice vest at half time to a different athlete for a different reason at the timeline of their performance. Here we've done some work, and actually this work did come off after speaking to people like Mike Tipton, through talking to Jim House at other universities who Mike works very closely with. We're working with the wheelchair rugby athletes in preparation for one of their tournaments. We introduced the use of a fan because the athletes were just water spraying their face, putting ice cooling on their necks to make themselves feel less sort of straining in terms of the thermal stress, but it wasn't lowering their body core temperature because it wasn't evaporating the heat away from the body. So again, sort of international collaborations, internal, working with other universities enabled us to provide some really good guidance for the British Paralympic Association when they were preparing their athletes for overseas competitions, whether that be in a thermal neutral environment such as wheelchair rugby or outside working with wheelchair tennis and other sports. But I think it's been said before me, it's very, very important that we must talk to the athletes, work with the coaches. And so we very much do, as part of the Peter Harrison Centre's research, work through that embedded environment and make sure the questions that we're answering are gleaned from the population and the sports that we are working with. We use this sort of knowledge action cycle that a lot of you might have read if you work in high performance sports or indeed looking to translate your research, where we obviously try to look at the questions, we look at tailoring interventions around some science, we monitor the use of the science, we evaluate the outcomes, we get new knowledge and we start again. It's a continuous activity that we do year by year, accelerating the physiology that we might provide the athletes that we're working with. Just one very quick experiment that I must highlight here is using this interdisciplinary approach of ergonomics, and I'm a physiologist but working with the biomechanists. So I want to draw your attention to, in a moment, what happened in the tent, but this is work that we put together where we were trying to optimise the wheelchair tennis players' tennis serve in preparation for going out to Tokyo. So we basically took the tennis environment to Loughborough Sport, to the tennis courts. We set up the Vicon 3D analysis to look at some tennis serves from a three-dimensional point of view. That was pre. We then undertook a game of tennis, but in a tent, and then we then re-evaluated the tennis serve and some sprints after that period of fatigue. So I'm in a physiology session here, but what I'm trying to show is that collaboration with the biomechanics team, with the excellence of physiology, not only gave an understanding of the tennis serve to the technical coaches, what it gave us was an understanding around different strategies that we could ask the coaches and the players to implement when they were away preparing for Tokyo. So I won't go into detail on this, but effectively there was a cooling strategy of ingesting sort of ice at intervals whilst the athlete was sprinting in that tent before they went back out and did some tennis serves. So here's one of our athletes taking the ice on board here, and simply what we were looking to do was offset that rise in body core temperature in the condition where they had ice versus the trial where they didn't have ice, as well as collecting biomechanical data to feed back to the coaches. And hey presto, ice did have an impact, and again there is a research article that people can read about the reduction as a result of the timing of the ice slurry. It was published, that's great, but most importantly, according to Mike and how I work as well, similar to Mike, it had an impact. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend the Tokyo Games because of COVID, but we can see here, this is Gordon, who medalled, and here is his ice slurry that was provided to him in an ice cooling box for the intervals during the tennis game. And he adopted the strategy that we recommended for him. A little bit pushed for time because I like to throw things in, but the last couple of slides this is the health and well-being aspects. So working with the high-performance coaches and practitioners within UKSI, this was a slide that came from the health and well-being team, which was around a sport, I won't mention it, but a particular Paralympic sport where they reported the number of days lost and the amount of occurrences of pressure sores, broken finger, upper respiratory tract infection, etc. of some Paralympic athletes. Through working with rehabilitation specialists in exercise physiology, we undertook some functional electrical stimulation to provide a stimulus in the paralysed legs to increase the blood flow, increase the temperature of the lower legs, increase the sort of physiology in an area that the athlete was unable to activate themselves. What that resulted in this particular athlete who had a lot of pressure sore instances was they were able to compete and not actually being drawn away to have bed rest as a result of pressure sores. So we were applying the physiology from rehabilitation to high performance athletes and using that information as well. So finally, impact. We don't just want PhDs sat on the shelf. So what I do is not necessarily policy documents with PhysSoc, but I would consider that. We produce infographics. I've published some in British Journal of Sports Medicine here with George Havenoff around cooling techniques of wheelchair rugby players. We've produced some for the sports around ice slurries and wheelchair tennis performance. And we've produced some around caffeine for upper body exercise performance and how that might impact hand cycling and wheelchair rugby performance as well. I have had impact on rules and regulations, but I'm happy to talk about that during the networking session. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you to Vicky again for that really insightful discussion. It's really interesting to hear about the high impact work being done in parasport at Loughborough. And now to talk about another really prominent topic, we have Dr. Sam Rowland, who's going to talk about female physiology and performance in the school.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm just going to start by going back a little bit and doing a bit of history before going into some of the content of what we do here at Loughborough. I thought this image was really interesting because it gives us some idea of what was going on just 60 years ago. So not long ago, this was a scenario for a woman called Catherine Switzler, who was the first woman to run a marathon in Boston. But in order to do this, she had to hide in a bush before the start line. She was constantly trying to be pulled away from the race as she was going through it and eventually managed to finish. So we've come from this place where actually 60 years ago, women weren't actually able to do the marathon. Contrast that with where we are now, and women's sport is bigger and better than ever in 2024. And this has probably been helped by some huge success stories. So whether this is the Lionesses winning the Euros in 2022, setting the precedent for the men this year, or whether it's Emily Campbell securing Great Britain's first white medal as a weightlifting athlete. And what we can also see from an equality perspective is there's certainly been movement in the right direction. And for the first time in Olympic history, there will be equal participation by males and females at the Paris Olympics this year and this summer, which I think is fantastic. So where are we in terms of the literature? Well, despite these advances in women's sport, the field of research is still significant underrepresentation of women within that. There is definitely movement in the right direction, and that sentiment is certainly held around the room, and I'm going to demonstrate today some of the fabulous work that has been done in this space. but there is definitely capacity for more work to be done in female physiology and female sporting performance. And this was quite nicely highlighted by this paper, which talked about the quality and quantity paradox. So what we have got and what we have had over the last few years is an evolution of people doing research in women, which is obviously fantastic. But some of that research has been limited in quality, with this paper suggesting that only 8% of the data is high enough quality for us to make firm conclusions back into the applied world, which, as we've just heard from Vicky, is fundamentally what's important. If we want to talk about informing practice for elite athletes or at participation level, the quality of that work needs to be sufficient. And I know everybody in the room is aware of this, but why is it needed? Well, clearly there are sex differences in body size and composition between men and women. So whether we're thinking about the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system, the bone, immune function, gut microbiota, the list continues, there are sex differences there. And there's therefore good rationale that there may be differences between men and women. So simply applying previous research which has been done in men to women won't necessarily give us the answers for our female athletes and females taking part in exercise. So that then moves me on to some of the research that we've been doing here within the school. I'm going to start by detailing some of the work around the sex differences that we've been doing before moving on to women-only based studies. And I thought a good place to start was my third year dissertation supervisor, Professor David Stencil. So as a lot of you in the room will know, David is an expert in the field of exercise metabolism and appetite regulation. David has conducted multiple experimental studies and written many review areas in this area, so he's much better placed to speak about it than I am. But looking over his work, it was quite clear that the consensus from his sex differences work is that actually the effects of exercise on appetite, appetite hormones and appetite regulation may not be so different between men and women. But he does allude in this review article to there being further research that's needed in this space. Slightly different field, but we have expertise in hydration research. And Dr. Lewis James is an expert in the field of hydration and is currently involved in several projects being led by PhD students who are in the room, looking at male and females and how their response to a hydration status may differ. And one of the cool studies that we heard about yesterday in preparation for a presentation that Tom Cable is going to be doing soon is how physiological responses to dehydration may actually differ between men and women. So Tom's study is still in finalisation, but their data at the moment is suggesting that actually in female runners, dehydration may impair running performance compared to being in a hydrated state. Whereas in males, that dehydration doesn't seem to be having such a detrimental effect. And they've got an interesting finding that suggests this may be linked with usual ad libitum energy intake, water consumption being different, or their habits being different between men and women. So that's really cool, and it gives a good avenue for future research in this area, which I know Tom and Lewis together will be talking about ideas, but hot off the press new research, which I think is quite exciting in this space. And then to jump to a completely different field, obviously Professor Jonathan Folland is an expert in neuromuscular function and muscle morphology, and he's conducted numerous work in sex difference work as well. So in collaboration with British Athletics, he recently published a paper which explains why men can typically sprint faster than women. Now, previous research has suggested, with limited evidence, that height, body fat and muscularity may explain differences between men and women's performance, but that evidence base wasn't really there to support that. And what Jonathan's research has found that actually it's the size of specific muscle groups, so it's the hip extensors and the knee flexors that enable elite male sprinters to outperform those of our female sprinters. Jonathan is also interested in looking at injury incidents and whether there are sex differences in this. And it won't have escaped many of you in the room that ACL injuries are particularly common in female athletes, and that's been in the media particularly over the last couple of years. So he wanted to explore whether that was anything to do with muscle morphology. And indeed, Jonathan observed that the knee flexors that help to stabilise the knee joint and prevent strain to the ACL are smaller in females compared with males. And this may give us some explanation as to why this is disproportionately reported in our female athletes compared to our male athletes. And then again, a different sort of topic area. So what I'm trying to highlight here is the breadth across the department. We've got research by Dr. Nicola Payne, who works in the space of immune and inflammatory changes to psychological stress. She does this via looking at active methods, such as mental arithmetic or stressful mathematics situations, but also through passive methods, such as cold pressor tests, which for anyone not familiar is where you put your foot or a wrist into a cold bath and you instigate a sympathetic response. And as part of this work, Nicola looks at sex differences to see if there are differences between men and women in their psychological stress response. And in line with previous observations, in this work that I'm presenting here, Nicola has shown that males actually exhibit greater vascular and respiratory responses to a range of psychosocial stressors compared to females. And then we're also doing some work that's looking exclusively in female or women-based populations. So I thought I'd start by going back to the earliest part of the lifespan and talking about what we do from a paediatric physiology perspective in looking in children and adolescent girls and boys. So Dr. Keith Tolfrey is dedicated to improving the metabolic health of both young boys and girls. What we know and what some of Keith's papers tell us is that sedentary behaviour increases throughout the lifespan and in childhood, but actually physical inactivity becomes more of a problem in young girls and adolescent girls than it does boys. So a lot of the work that Keith has been doing has been around how can we improve the metabolic health of this population with interventions such as high intensity exercise, or whether it's looking at the breakfast foods that individuals consume to see if we can create interventions to work for those adolescent girls. Similarly, although in a different population, Dr. Bryony Christmas has conducted research in a Qatari population where cultural, environmental and logistical factors typically promote a more sedentary lifestyle, and particularly in females. And her work has observed beneficial effects of breaking up prolonged sitting time on a range of psychobiological factors. Bryony is also partners with several women's wear clothing companies, and she operates and does some work with those too as part of her remit. Dr. Lee Taylor has done some work with elite female athletes, so he works across the environmental physiology perspective, and he's looking at different strategies to mitigate the effects of environmental temperature on performance. Lee has published work on the effectiveness of short duration, low-cost acclimatization camp protocols, and also cooling strategies such as ice vests. Pertinent for today's talk, but Tom Clifford has conducted some work looking at football players. In collaboration with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, he has written a narrative review identifying 6 major topics for kind of concern and identification that are relevant to female football players. And these include physical demands, talent identification, body composition, injury risk, health and nutrition. Tom has also been involved in experimental data collection with female footballers, again in collaboration with GSSI. And some of this work that looked at differences in fluid balance and carbohydrate intakes of our football players. And this found that actually carbohydrate intakes were below recommendations both in training and in matches for our females. And therefore this highlighted a really good gap in the literature, or a gap for applied practitioners to make change there. So if our athletes aren't consuming enough carbohydrate, are they performing and training optimally? Of course they're not. So that gave a good option then for intervention at an applied level. And Tom has also done some work recently with Brighton Hove Albion, looking at wellbeing metrics and whether they differ across the menstrual cycle phase. Myself and Stephen conducted some work using dietary nitrate supplementation as an ergogenic aid, and we wanted to see whether actually nitrate may be more efficacious in a female population compared with the male population. So as part of my PhD, I looked at whether dietary nitrate supplementation would be more effective across different phases of the menstrual cycle, or between pill users and those with a regular menstrual cycle. Those works are still in formation at the moment, and we hope to publish this soon, but what has been born out of this research is some really interesting areas for future direction in female populations. And particularly those that I'd like to mention are those individuals with endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome and preeclampsia. All of these female populations have a heightened cardiovascular risk, and we know that dietary nitrate supplementation can be beneficial in this context. So for us, that's highlighted quite a nice area for future research that we may be able to do together. We did get a paper out of this, though, that was relevant using females looking at a gut metabolite. So this work is still embodied at the moment, but we hope to move this forward. And of course, I couldn't do a talk on female physiology without highlighting the excellent work that's been done by Dr. Emma O'Donnell. Emma focuses specifically on female athlete health, performance and well-being. She has done work across the lifespan in females, so she's worked with premenopausal women through to postmenopausal women, and she's focused on understanding how estrogen status can affect athlete health, well-being and cardiovascular health specifically. And what I recently heard, and Emma didn't tell me on email because she's probably too modest, is that she's actually part of a consensus group at the moment informing RED strategies. So Emma's collaborating internationally with colleagues, and I know they meet on a Sunday afternoon at 4:30 because I heard it recently, to kind of inform guidelines in this area. So Emma is our leading expert in the cardiovascular health from a female physiology perspective. So just briefly before I finish, I'd just like to show you a little bit about what we're doing at the moment, so what's in progress in the department. So of course Emma is still leading in this space, which is excellent. So we've got Emma doing some research with support of PhD students in the space of looking at menstrual function and menstrual dysfunction and cardiovascular health. Dr. Rich Blagrove is also doing some work around menstrual cycle symptoms and your ability to train and compete depending on phase of the menstrual cycle. And a shameless plug for myself, I'm also looking at whether gastrointestinal symptoms and permeability differ across phases of the menstrual cycle and with contraceptive use. And if anyone's interested in me speaking to them about that, the networking session would be great. We've got Dr. Catherine Brooke-Wavell, who's looking at osteoporosis fractures in female athletes. Dr. Laura Barrett's looking at GPS tracking in youth athletes. And we've got Steve Mears looking at different hydration effects of different drinks in different female populations. So what I've hopefully highlighted over the last 15 minutes or so is the breadth of work that we're doing here within the department across physiology, ranging from appetite to hydration, neuromuscular function, cardiovascular health. We cover a large breadth in everything that we're doing here at Loughborough. And my last slide then, so I think it felt prudent to finish this talk by briefly highlighting the Women in Sport Hub, which is being led by Dr. Emma Cullen. And now the agenda of the Women in Sport Hub, for anyone that isn't familiar, is to enhance the interdisciplinary research that's conducted within the university to advance work that is conducted in women. This is still at the early stages of development, but as part of this initiative, we do have a guest speaker coming to visit in July, Dr. Marissa Baranukas. I'm sure I don't pronounce that correctly, but she's visiting in July. She will be hosting a talk, which I think the email has gone around about. If anyone's interested in speaking with Marissa, please get in touch with myself because I'm arranging meetings on a one-to-one basis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam, for providing an excellent overview of all the great work that's being done here in female physiology at Loughborough University. And I know we're all delighted that you'll soon be joining us on the staff, so you'll be able to move this forward, I'm sure, to excellent levels in the future, not least because you don't have me anymore as a PhD supervisor to hold you back. So I'm sure you're going to do great work in this space. So it's now a great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Mark Burnley. He'll be the last talk of today's session. Clyde on his early slides indicated one of the key themes was in endurance physiology. Mark is going to provide a nice overview of the current work that's being done in endurance physiology in the school. So I'll hand over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, for the younger members of the audience, this is obviously a slide of our Chancellor winning the Olympics being chased by a BBC Sport commentator. And of course, at this stage in a race, a commentator might say something along the lines of, "It's who wants it more." And I'm pretty certain by the look on his face that Steve Cram wants it pretty badly, but he's not going to get it, and the reason for that is physiology. And Loughborough has a long history of excellence in the area of endurance physiology, and I'd just like to update you with some of the work that is currently going on in this area. Now, the first physiologist to really understand the relationship between human physiology, fatigue and endurance is, of course, A.V. Hill, and we are currently going through a centenary of his seminal work on human physiology and performance. And one of the things he looked at and published in 2 papers in 1925 is the speed-duration relationship. And he noticed that regardless of exercise modality, the relationship between speed and duration was common. So short races were conducted at high speeds. There was a rapid drop-off in speed, which would then lead to a plateau or an asymptote after about 12 or 13 minutes or so. And what he was able to do was put flesh on the physiological bones of this relationship. And the way he discussed it is actually quite interesting in relation to how we see things today. So some of the terms I've highlighted here are still common. So a critical speed, below which there is a genuine dynamic equilibrium, which today we call a steady state, above which maximal oxygen uptake is inadequate, metabolites are accumulating, fatigue and exhaustion setting in. And that's not a million miles away from how we see it today. And A.V. Hill was a solid gold genius, but we have updated it since. And this is the, if you like, the modern conception of this. We now know that critical speed or critical power is a submaximal exercise parameter, above which no steady state is possible. And that's what you see in the red there, reaching VO2 max with task failure or exhaustion occurring soon after. Below the critical power, we see the attainment of a steady state, heavy intensity exercise. Exercise can continue for a considerable period of time. And the scientist who should really be credited with developing this model of VO2 kinetics is the late, great Brian J. Whipp. He was my PhD examiner, so if you think about sitting in front of Brian and answering questions for 2.5 hours, that was every bit as bad as a PhysOc presentation back in the day. But Brian was also a very talented decathlete in his earlier years, here doing the high jump properly with an iron bar and a sand pit. But he was so good, he was offered a place at Loughborough College, and he did his first higher education qualification in physical education. And I say that because Loughborough has a history not simply of training students, but training future field leaders, of which Brian was clearly one. But one of the things Brian said about the non-steady state and the VO2 response in the non-steady state is that it's actually an index of the ongoing fatigue process. And we can measure that in a number of different ways, and one of the ways is with high-density EMG. So we put electrode arrays on various muscle groups, and we can decompose the signal and track what motor units are actually doing during the fatigue process. So here we have some data from Tamara Valencic and Jakub Skarabot. And what they've done here is ramp and hold contractions at 50% of the maximal voluntary torque, and then a ramp down again. And from the signals you pick up from the surface of the skin, you can detect various motor units and track them as fatigue progresses. And you can see a couple of elements of common motor unit behaviour going on. So if we take this motor unit here in the first contraction and compare it to what it's doing in the second one, it's increased its firing rate. We can also see another motor unit is recruited in that second contraction, and those processes will continue as fatigue progresses. And when you look at the motor unit firing rate, what this paper discovered was that there's a slight reduction, reaches an inflection point, and then systematically increases until task failure occurs. And at that point, the motor unit is not firing at the maximum rate that it could. So we've got a reaction to peripheral fatigue, but also some central fatigue, curtailing maximal firing rate. And if you think about what's happening here, of course, there's also motor unit recruitment going on. All of that is going to increase the energy cost of the task, the oxygen requirement of the task, which might partially explain this slow component driving VO2 to VO2 max. But that process only occurs above the critical power. So it'd be worth knowing what it is that causes critical power so that we can do something about trying to increase the scope of the work in which this kind of thing does not happen. And there's been some phenomenal work in this area done at Loughborough. This is with Emma Mitchell, supervised by Richard Ferguson. What they did here was they took muscle biopsies and then determined muscle fibre type and capillary morphology with the data using immunohistochemistry staining, so using various antibodies. You see the red fibres there, those are type 1 slow twitch fibres. The blue are type 2 fibres. And then the luminous green, those are the capillaries. And you can see here a participant with a low critical power and one with a high critical power. And it's visually obvious what the differences are. When they correlated these, you can see there's a strong positive correlation between the critical power and the percentage of type 1 muscle fibres. What they also found was there was an extremely strong correlation between the capillary contacts per fibre and critical power, both for type 1 fibres and type 2 fibres. Now we know that the mitochondrial sink, if you like, for oxygen is far larger than the cardiovascular system can supply, and so if you want to maintain a high rate of oxidative energy transfer, you need a high rate of oxygen transport and therefore peripheral oxygen delivery, and that's why we see this high capillary density in the muscle as well. But we can also look inside the muscle itself and understand what that oxidative machinery is doing. And we can do that in a number of different ways. We can take a muscle biopsy and we can make homogeneous measurements of citrate synthase activity. That's our measure of mitochondrial volume density. But we can also permeabilize the fibers and put them into a high-resolution respirometer so we can actually measure the electron transfer system and its maximal rate as well, and correlate that with the critical power. And this is work done by, amongst others, Don Pedden, Stephen Bailey, and Richard Ferguson as well. And so when we do that, we first of all see the relationship between critical power and citrate synthase activity is a strong and positive correlation. But what we really want to know is what's going on in the electron transfer system. And to do that, we use a protocol where we provide various substrates, uncouplers and inhibitors, so that we can determine both the coupled and uncoupled maximal rate of electron transfer across or in complexes 1 and 2, if you like, the entry stages of the electron transfer system. And then what you can do is take those data and correlate that with critical power. And there's no positive or, in fact, no correlation in those data. It's actually a nice negative finding, because in this particular case what it means is if you want to improve your critical power, you need to grow your metabolic machinery. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about the vagaries of, or the intrinsic properties of the mitochondria themselves. And of course what improving critical power will do is increase the scope of the heavy intensity domain, if you like. And the key difference there is that the fatigue mechanisms, and therefore the reason why you're able to endure, is very different from the severe domain. So we're talking about metabolic accumulation and depletion here, and we're talking about many different things in this domain. Things like fuel utilization, glycogen depletion, fluid losses in the heat, for example, central fatigue, and muscle damage if the exercise modality is relevant. And Loughborough has done work in all of these areas in the past. What I'd like to do is highlight one area of strength, and that is environmental physiology and hydration. And Lewis James has led on some work, and I see Mark Funnell's also in the audience. And this was a study that really highlights the rigour of work here at Loughborough, because when hydration studies are typically done, to impose hypohydration, that's usually done by fluid restriction. If you're then going to have a performance measure in there, the participant may be influenced by the fact that they know they're getting less drink. So it's not blinded, and so they might expect a worse performance, and so you're essentially generating a nocebo effect in all of your research. And that needed sorting out. So what Mark and Lewis did was set up a study where they both had a blinded condition and an unblinded condition for their participants. In the unblinded condition, the participants were told exactly what was going to happen. So you're going to have a euhydration condition where we're going to feed you drink, and a hypohydration condition where we're going to restrict it, and then we're going to do a performance trial, and we're expecting it to be worse because that's what we would expect. Then they had a blinded condition, and they used a nasogastric tube here to feed the participants, or to infuse the participants with the amount of fluid they wanted for each condition. The key point here is the participants were told that they were testing 2 different sports drinks, and they didn't want taste to get in the way of that, and so that they would be euhydrated in both conditions. So the participants were expecting the same level of hydration when they came to do the performance trial. Then they set them off on 2 hours of steady state cycling at 50% of maximal work rate in the heat, which must have been fun. And then they did a time trial of a fixed amount of work, which would take approximately 15 minutes, but they tried to complete that work as fast as possible. And here's what they found. So in the unblinded condition, as you would expect, hypohydration led to worse performance than the euhydrated condition. But in the blinded participants, those that thought they were euhydrated in both cases, exactly the same effect on performance. So this is the first work to show that hypohydration does have a negative impact on performance, even when you think you're euhydrated. So it is not a nocebo effect. Now, thinking about, so the reason I say that is because this is a really nice example of how Loughborough often goes, and usually goes the extra mile in trying to get to the right answer in this kind of work. Talking about going extra miles, I'd like to finish off with what I think is the next frontier in endurance physiology, and that's durability. And physiologists being physiologists, we have 3 names for this now, so it's durability, fatigue resistance, or resilience, depending on which literature you read. But it's the notion that the parameters of fitness we know about, things like running economy, VO2 max, lactate threshold, critical speed, etc., we assume they're fixed. So when you measure them in the fresh state, those will be the parameters that last throughout any race. But if you do enough exercise, eventually those parameters will start to break down. And in this case, Michele Zanini, supervised by Jonathan Folland and Richard Blagrove, they were looking at the effect of long duration exercise on running economy. So they had 2 groups running for 90 minutes at their first lactate threshold, and then they were measuring the oxygen cost of exercise as it went along. And you can see that after about 10 kilometres, the oxygen cost starts to rise in both groups. But in the high performance runners, it rose less. In other words, they were more durable. And you might then think, well, for the low performance runners, what could be done to enhance that durability? Well, there's training, obviously, but there are other studies done in Exeter, where Michele has been for a while, where they've looked at feeding carbohydrate. And it turns out that carbohydrate feeding can improve durability in those that lack it. And that sort of goes all the way back to the beginnings of Loughborough and its studies of carbohydrate metabolism. So I'd just like to end by acknowledging just some of the people who are working in this area. I haven't included too many PhD students, but I'm going to have 2 or 3 further slides with people working in this area. So, and this work continues, and it is definitely excellent. And one final thing to say on the subject of endurance. Today marks my 15th wedding anniversary. So I would like to thank my wife for exercising tolerance. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much there, Mark, for providing an excellent overview for all the great work in endurance physiology that is done in the school. So, personally, I think that's been an absolutely fabulous afternoon there of presentations to really highlight the breadth and depth of quality of work that's done in physiology. As I said, we could have had a whole day dedicated to this with different staff and colleagues presenting, but I think the colleagues who have presented have done a wonderful job of showcasing what great work has been done here, starting from the early roots that Clyde has highlighted, onto some of the milestones Mark pointed out, to some of the other work that's gone on. We did have a packed schedule, so we didn't have time between the talks for any questions, but what we do have now outside is a networking reception, so I hope some of you can join for a drink before many of you, I'm sure, will shoot off to the football. So there'll hopefully be good opportunities there for networking and further discussions. So it just remains for me to thank our speakers today for their great contributions. And again, I'd like to thank the Physiological Society for honouring us with this great award. It really does mean a great deal to us to be recognised by the Society in this way. And I hope this has actually stimulated colleagues to think how they can engage more widely with the Physiological Society moving forward. So that I'd like to bring today's session to a close, and I'd like to invite you all outside to have a drink and celebrate this award for the school. So thank you everyone for coming.